Howdy, how's it going, everybody? Today we're looking at the third video by American Wasp with Deter McBusiness. I've already done a reaction to his first two videos. This is a guy I respect immensely. I love his input. I love his perspective. We've been in communication back and forth, and I figured I'd give him the due respect that I think he clearly deserves by reacting to his third video. I think he needs a whole lot more attention, a whole lot more subs. This guy seems very professional. He really seems to know exactly what he's talking about. He's been spot on. He says a lot of the same things that I think. Yeah, without further ado, we're going to do a reaction to his third video here. Let's see what it is called. The Right-Wing Magic Trick, How American Exceptionalism Becomes American Narcissism. This ought to be good. So just a heads up, if you happen to hear noise in the background, my roommates are watching Breaking Bad. One of the best shows in the world, period, hands down. So yeah, apologies if you happen to hear anything in the background. Let's do it.
The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Thomas Jefferson.
Patriotism is the virtue of the vicious, according to Oscar Wilde. Thank you for making my point.
Arguing that GOP politicians have spent the last 40 years, really much longer than that, emotionally manipulating conservative voters, specifically rural, uneducated whites, into voting against their own socioeconomic interests is not original. But arguing that future left-wing political success will derive from understanding the efficacy of that strategy is.
Completely agree with this. Sorry to pause on this phase like that. Yeah, that is something I have preached about on this channel. The left really doesn't spend a lot of time focusing on the strategy of right-wing media and manipulating its base into a permanent following, I guess you could say, like unquestionable loyalty. Like the voter base is always going to be there because of right-wing media in the echo chambers.
The complete quote.
I'm also going to have it just a little bit sped up so we can get through it a bit quicker.
From Oscar Wilde, featured in the best action film of all time. Rest in peace, Sean Connery, People Magazine's sexiest man of the century.
I don't disagree with that.
Is patriotism is the virtue of the vicious. Exaggerated patriotism is the most insincere form of self-conceit.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Absolutely. Like, you hear a lot from the right-wing media and conservatives about virtue signaling. There is no bigger virtue signal, more prominent than American patriotism. That is a glue which holds conservatism together and has been for years. Of course, it's evolved over time because ultimately conservatives don't really have values per se. They just have talking points.
Who knew? A dead Irish poet from the late 1800s, imprisoned and exiled for being gay, could capture better than any of us ever could the fundamental problem with post-Cold War American political discourse. Pride. A special kind of pride. The kind of pride you feel when your sports team wins a championship. The kind of pride that doesn't come from individual achievement, but rather a sense of belonging. In the case of American conservatives, not just to a large group, but to the largest group. Not just to a powerful group, but to the most powerful group. Not just to a winning group, but to the winningest group. And what's more is that this group of winners has a noble purpose: defending America from the nefarious forces of societal change. The intellectual premise of conservatism.
That's it. Conservatives are terrified of change. It's in the name. Conserve. Brilliant.
Is, after all, resistance to change. Welcome to the third foundational episode of American Wasp, where we all agree you don't get change in America by asking nicely. I am your host, Deter McBusiness, New England's favorite white Anglo-Saxon Protestant gone West Coastal.
I'm probably
Today's
not
episode
a good
is
spot.
entitled The Right-Wing Magic Trick: How American Exceptionalism Became American Narcissism.
You know what? I'm gonna move
Magic
this down here.
is the art of distraction. If the audience is looking at the right hand, they're not paying attention to what the left hand is doing.
The artist.
Well, for at least the last 4
distraction.
decades, the Republican Party has pulled off the greatest magic trick in American political history by manipulating its voters into thinking Republican political leaders actually care about their problems. The efficacy of this strategy has grown exponentially since the advent of conservative media, because, as the enlightened spiritual luminary Robin Sharma teaches, an addiction to distraction is the end of your creative production.
Case in point, me. Would I rather just be like scrolling on my phone all day, or making videos for YouTube, or making music? Yeah, seriously. This is why my bio on my personal social media is, with every breath you take, create something.
We'll discuss why conservative creativity is a contradiction in terms in a future episode. For now, a very basic analysis of conservative politics since Reagan reveals that the macro-level Republican political strategy since at least 1980 has been to distract the American public with cultural as opposed to socioeconomic political discourse. My 7th Deter dichotomy derives from my 3rd Deter decree. Conservatism cloaks itself in cultural crusading to defend the economic interests of the status quo.
100%.
Dark and difficult times lie ahead. Soon we must all face the choice between what is right and what is easy.
Oh man. Yeah. Obligatory fuck J.K. Rowling.
The simple truth is that culture is a hell of a lot easier to understand than the socioeconomic relationships between the citizens, the government, the private sector. Understanding how those 3 variables interact with each other requires the rigor of research, contemplation, and perhaps most importantly, productive discussion with others. You know, education.
Yeah.
Understanding why this magical strategy of cultural distraction has worked so well for so long starts with considering my 8th Deter dichotomy, which defines the psychological context for this mass manipulation by right-wing media and politicians. Everyone struggles with this intellectual hindrance, but conservatives struggle more than the rest of us with distinguishing between feeling right and being right. Yes, this is a fresh take on confirmation bias and groupthink, for those of you that were smart enough to study social psychology. Our feelings are our instincts. When media outlets and personalities tell us what we want to hear as opposed to what we need to hear, they are stimulating our survival instincts,
Yeah.
instead of any interest we might have in exploring alternative viewpoints and ideas. Let's face it, when anyone is emotional, they're not likely to listen to alternative perspectives. Whether they're angry, depressed, or even manically happy, only truly enlightened people can process challenges to their worldview when their emotions are not completely stable. I would argue that intellectual availability is only truly realized when a listener has control of their emotions or is at least aware of them. Put simply, and this is something hardcore Christian conservatives agree with, we are emotional beings first, intellectual beings second.
Yeah.
Thus, in order to transcend our inner survivor's resistance to change, we must be at least aware of our emotions, if not completely in control of them.
100%.
When someone is emotional, they're reactive.
Conservatism in a nutshell. Literally, like, it reminds me of real life interactions I've had with people who do consume reactionary media and have all their talking points just at the ready. And it's all literally the same thing because they get it from the exact same people. Like, oh, I don't have a problem with trans people, just leave children alone. You know? And it's like, okay, but that's not actually happening. Like, no one's going after your children. The only people who are going after your children, this is just an example, are the parents of those children because of the media that they consume, because they are taught that being trans is evil and accepting trans people is wrong. Why? Who the fuck knows? But that's exactly right. Emotional reaction first, intellectual intelligence, that comes second. Conservatism to a T. Conservative media to a T. And a lot of them are very much aware of what they're doing. The Ben Shapiros, the Stephen Crowthers, the Candace Owens, because the reactionary content they put out generates clicks, thereby generates revenue, thereby fills their pockets.
Many conservative Americans, I argue, spend their entire lives reacting to their surroundings.
And on top of all this, you mentioned cultural versus socioeconomic. Sorry, I can barely talk right now. What's more likely to generate headlines? This goes for a lot of different news media, but some celebrity, embraces trans people, or the Bud Light ad. The Bud Light ad is a good example of Dylan Mulvaney. I wouldn't have had any idea who Dylan Mulvaney was if it wasn't for that Bud Light ad campaign. Are people going to cling to that story? Is the news going to want to report on that? Or are they going to want to report on the fact that wages have been stagnating for the past 50 years, while overall production and CEO pay and CEO bonuses have, skyrocketed over that same amount of time? But a lot of people just don't seem to care.
As opposed to taking control of their lives by reflecting on their decisions long enough to transcend the ignorance of their upbringing. They're caught in a loop of thoughts that ultimately keep telling them they don't need or maybe even deserve a better life. The one they got right now is good enough. But the sad truth is that they're wrong. In the rare moments when they do park their pride in the quiet times of the day, long enough to reflect, they face the ugly, inconvenient truth that they actually do want change. They're simply either too scared to create it, or perhaps more tragically, don't know how to create it.
Yeah.
Because they're too proud to listen.
Yep.
So whether or not they realize it, conservative Americans are resistant to change because they are, not surprisingly, afraid of change. Specifically, they are more afraid of losing what they have in the present, their status quo, than they are hopeful about a better future. Because a better future requires change. And damned if change ain't the scariest thing in the world to these people.
Mm-hmm.
My ninth Deter dichotomy addresses
100%.
the most effective method of magical manipulation of the masses of conservative America by once again playing off of the ugly, uncomfortable, inconvenient truth of human cognition and behavior that by and large, most humans do what is easy, not what is right. For that reason, students of political persuasion will tell you that using anecdotes to influence the public is far more effective than using data.
Yep.
Put more simply, stories work better than statistics.
Yeah.
At least.
Yeah. No, seriously. You will have all sorts of gullible people on social media that openly reject data, statistics, analysis, etc., in favor of stories they've heard, personal anecdotes, because they have an emotional attachment to that. They became emotionally manipulated to embrace and accept it in the face of contrary evidence in the form of data, mass collected data from countless anecdotes. It reflects brilliantly the intellectual deficiency of which fuels conservatism. And it's out there. The studies are real. Conservatives and fascists alike have lower cognitive ability than other political ideologies, linked to lower IQ, worse critical thinking skills. And it's been demonstrated time and time again.
When it comes to capturing and keeping people's attention, because stories play off our emotions by humanizing problems, while statistics remove emotion from analysis by treating people like numbers. It's easier for someone to empathize with an individual that has a name, a face, a family, and friends than it is to large groups of people all at once, which is what statistics should do for those interested in understanding the country at large. For example, if I hear directly from a struggling black family in inner city Detroit by watching them be interviewed on TV, let's say, that's going to resonate with me emotionally a lot better than listening to some well-dressed, arrogant political commentator with perfect hair list off a bunch of statistics about inner city hardship. Now, for the conservative audience, story time.
Don't get me wrong. Me, I love stories. Love hearing them, love telling them. It's a pastime that goes back thousands of years, for crying out loud. And I think that's just such a fundamental issue rooted in our history as a species. We tend to accept stories in the face of numbers.
I'm with your trusty Fox News personality telling you tales that would have you believe no uniformed cop ever makes a mistake is much more influential than citing statistics proving we got a lot of bullies wearing badges when it comes to law enforcement at large in this country. With that said, just as good journalists shouldn't adhere to Mark Twain's adage, never let the truth stand in the way of a good story, unless you can't think of anything else better, good public servants should not buy into Twain's other tongue-in-cheek cliche, there are three kinds of lies. Lies, damn lies, and statistics. Despite what many established political strategists might say, statistics can win the day. They just have to be delivered in an attention-grabbing way.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
More on that in a minute.
Yes.
Twain allegedly borrowed...
It's not a breadtube video if it doesn't include the line, but we'll get to that in a minute, but we'll go back to that.
With that quote from the first British Prime Minister of Jewish descent, by the way, but no one really knows for sure who said it first. Twain was an American wasp with ties to 19th century Kentucky, like all legendary American wasps. So let's go ahead and give him credit for the preceding and following quote. I am said to be a revolutionist in my sympathies, by birth, by breeding, and by principle. I am always on the side of the revolutionists, because there never was a revolution unless there were some oppressive and intolerable conditions against which to revolute. But I digress. Stories/anecdotes naturally trump data/statistics as tools of rhetorical influence for the same reason we instantly find our own face when we look at a picture of ourselves with a group of friends. We cannot help but be primarily concerned with our own appearance first. After we check to make sure we look good, we check how the people we like and don't like look. Then we finally look at the picture at large and process the entire image. Anecdotes, particularly those featured on Fox News and other conservative media outlets, allow viewers to look at the parts of the picture they want to see and to ignore the parts of the picture they don't want to see.
This is so brilliantly said in ways like I can't even fully express, but yeah. No, I wouldn't be surprised if I'll have to ask him. I'm pretty sure Deter's a psychology major, because like that's so spot on, and the way it applies to the propaganda put out by Fox News, etc. They know exactly what they're doing. They are fully well aware of it, and I can't wait for institutions like Fox News to start falling like dominoes.
Whenever I'm talking to a conservative or even a left-winger that simply doesn't know their data, I try to make them aware of this intellectual pitfall. My sixth Deter decree is when examining a public problem, look at the whole picture, not just the parts that make you feel good. Mm-hmm. Because the parts that make you feel bad within the context of public discourse require society's attention much more so than their easy, comfortable, bias-confirming counterparts.
Reminds me of those feel-good stories about like kids trying to sell lemonade to their neighborhood or whatever, so that way they could help fund the cancer treatment of one of their parents or something like that. Oh, well, this is a feel-good story. No, the fuck it's not.
My next two Deter dichotomies explain why these culture war distraction tactics of using emotional anecdotes works so well on conservative Americans by addressing the two most consistent demographic variables, aside from race, that separate left-wingers from right-wingers: life experience and education. Mm-hmm. My 10th Deter dichotomy represents a political pattern that has existed for centuries: the rural-urban divide. This sociocultural line of demarcation holds true across all Western democracies.
Bad pause, I'm sorry. I am someone very, very, very familiar with both of these. I spent my teenage years growing up in a rural county, a rural neighborhood, environment, high school. And it's remarkable how different it is than an urban environment. I've been to a couple different major cities. I work in a mid-sized city slash town, I guess you could say. So I'm exposed to it all. I see the differences. I see the similarities. You know, hard work is all around. It doesn't matter like if it's rural or urban, but the exposure, the experience between the people who live in a rural area versus an urban area or suburban, I guess, is pretty stark. Like you can see why rural areas tend to be conservative, like just lean towards conservatism, because they're afraid of change. They're just afraid in general. They're used to everything being the same because that's all their life is, just the same thing day in, day out. Whereas in an urban environment, you have no idea what the day is going to bring. It's hectic, it's chaotic. You come across all sorts of different people from all walks of life all the time. It's like the difference is immeasurable. And so, of course, your politics are going to lean more to the left, too, because you're a whole lot more open-minded. You are a whole lot more sympathetic to the plight of others. You understand a whole lot, a variety of perspectives rather than the few that you're exposed to in rural areas.
Rural voters are simply more resistant to change than urban and suburban voters.
Exactly what I just said.
Why? Because of what I just told you about them. Rustics are more afraid of losing what they have than they are hopeful about improving their current circumstances. Why do they choose fear over hope? Because, like children, rustics don't know any better. This is not a comment on their humanity.
Basically.
And I'm not trying to be condescending. This is fact-based, empathetic arithmetic to understand why large swaths of people are so scared of those that are different from them to the point of voting against their own socioeconomic interests just to spite these others. Rustics spend their days toiling the same farm in the same town they were born in, surrounded by the same people they've known their whole lives, and yeah, those people they're surrounded by probably look and talk a lot like they do. Urbanites and suburbanites, on the other hand, interact with people that are different from them on the daily, whether it be working at the office, commuting on the subway or bus, or even just walking down the street to grab a cup of coffee.
Yep.
White urbanites see that the struggle people who don't look and sound like them go through is not so different from their own.
Yes.
To white conservative rustics, however, African Americans, immigrants, gays, Muslims, they all might as well be aliens from Mars.
Seriously.
Since very few members of these groups live in rural areas, rustics' introduction to these and other groups usually comes through the lens of conservative media, which peddles the falsehood that America is a straight, white, Christian nation.
Yeah, it's absolutely disgusting. Like seriously, I'm 27 now, so high school is like a decade plus old at this point for me. But I remember just going up through middle school and high school and just like, I was so curious as to why so many of my peers, so many of my classmates were so stupid, were so ignorant. Like, to a cringe-worthy degree. That wasn't even, like, charming, you know? It wasn't cute. It was sad and embarrassing. And I really didn't have, like, the social skills or communication skills to really, like, emphasize that or point that out, even if I wanted to, you know. But looking back, it's just remarkable to me. Like I can't really express just how real this video is, and all these points are to a T.
And those who are not straight white Christians are not true Americans. Christian rustics will love thy neighbor as long as that neighbor is just like them. If that neighbor has a different skin color, speaks a different language, or even wears clothes that make the rustic uncomfortable, the rustic has no interest in knowing his neighbor and thus will never empathize with them.
Ironic.
The rural-urban divide only addresses the contextual circumstances of one's life experience, however, the environment within which their life takes place. The voluntary life experience many rural voters miss out on, and statistically speaking, the experiential variable that separates conservatives from liberals and progressives most is higher education. Many try to separate education and
Excuse me. To expand on this, because it's just bringing like a flurry of points in my head. Like, when you say someone that's educated versus uneducated, what that usually means is you get like a high school education, right? You graduate, you get your diploma. That's the end of it for a lot of people, like especially conservatives. But liberals and leftists are more prone to receiving college education, higher education, something past high school, pursuing something, some sort of field, And the more educated you are on any given variety of subjects, the more open-minded you are, the more experience you have studying various perspectives. But for conservatives, it doesn't even come close to that point. A lot of people end up in their 40s, 50s, and 60s with the same ideas and the same perspectives and thought processes that they had in their early 20s. And they just never grew beyond that point. Says a lot.
experience as two separate categories, but in truth,
And, sorry to keep interrupting, and conservative media knows this, which is why colleges are under constant scrutiny, under constant attack. They're indoctrinating our kids to be communists. Yeah. Especially the private colleges that rely on, profit to stay afloat. Yeah. Pay us hundreds of dollars and we'll teach you. Yeah, because communism will get you far in a capitalist society. Becoming a communist, learning about Marx. Sure, it's useful information, but it means nothing, and it's not even happening to begin with. It's just you're getting out there, you're seeing more of the world, you're meeting people, you're garnering experiences that you would have not had if you just stayed in your small hick town of 1,000 people where nothing happens.
education is just a specific form of life experience.
Yes.
And when I say higher education, I'm talking about at least college level education. With that in mind, my 11th Deter dichotomy addresses the ugly, uncomfortable truth that educated Americans are simply better at comprehending alternative viewpoints than uneducated Americans.
Correct.
You'll recall from my first Deter decree, we are all prisoners of our own personal experience. Well,
Yes.
as it turns out, that lesson right there is arguably the most important one in all of higher education.
100%. And it's from the first video. If you haven't checked it out yet, I suggest you do so.
Teaching people how little they know, making them
Yeah.
aware of their own ignorance. Because ignorance isn't a dirty word. We're all a little ignorant.
100%.
But those who sucked at school a little more so than the rest of us.
Yeah.
Those who sucked at school like to talk a big game about how useless college education is.
I mean, to be fair, I did suck at school. I probably graduated with like a 2.8 GPA. That's just because I'm a ADHD-riddled mess and couldn't really stay focused on one thing or another if I wasn't fully engaged with it.
For those of us who actually did the reading, did the homework, and raised our hand in class, we came to appreciate an infinitely important concept of modern society that is currently under assault by right-wing America right now. Expertise.
Yes.
Perhaps Socrates said it best.
Yep.
I am the wisest man alive, for I know one thing, and that is that I know nothing.
That's
Imagine
it.
how much more efficient and effective America's response to COVID would have been had we simply listened to the experts.
Seriously, can you imagine if, like, just any given number of politicians were that humble by admitting fault and admitting that, oh, I don't have a clue. This shouldn't be left up to me. I should refer or deter, no pun intended, to someone who clearly knows more than I do. Can you imagine? how much better the world would be?
The right-wing magic trick has dominated American politics for over 40 years. And it's done so by using a 3-stage process to manipulate the masses of conservative America. My third, Deter 3, is the 3 stages of influence within the context of mass-mediated messaging. Attention, point of view, point. In that order. Try to keep your terms organized here. The first and last elements are easiest to appreciate. No one can influence anyone else unless they have their attention, which, by the way, has never been harder to acquire than in today's media landscape, thus explaining the sensationalization in which for-profit media so frequently engages.
Big time.
Before even engaging in the communication, however, the influencer knows the point he's trying to make. For example, when Tucker Carlson comments on immigration, the point he's trying to communicate is that immigrants are criminals. He grabs your attention with stories about an immigrant who committed a crime somewhere, emphasizing the innocence of the victim to enrage the audience to get the reaction, what would you do to someone who hurt your son, daughter, father, or brother? There's the point of view. There's the connection between the story itself and the rural, uneducated white American watching it. What would you do? Not what should you do to someone who wrongs you, but what would you do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Very important distinction we'll address in an upcoming dichotomy.
Yep.
Perhaps the intellectual linchpin of social psychology's pursuit of comprehending human cognition and behavior is the anchor and adjustment heuristic. Long story short, it's when someone gets attached to an idea, such as buying a new car, let's say, then can't get away from that idea when small obstacles make it more difficult to maintain, such as incremental price increases due to things like, well, if you want it in green, that's going to be a little extra. The mass-mediated distraction that is the American culture war relies upon 3 major anchors of conservative cognition to capture the right-wing public's attention, to invoke the right-wing public's point of view, and finally, to influence them into thinking this country belongs to them and those who are different from them are trying to take it away. My 3 major anchors of conservative cognition are the past, the self, the fight. The past means the good old days to rural, white, Christian America. For it was during these good old days that America proved to the world that it is not only exceptional, but superlatively so, being the greatest country to ever exist. And the people, not the government, are the reason why.
And ironically, it was the government that made this argument through propaganda. Because a lot of conservatives like to point back to like the 50s, right? 50s, 60s, where America was at its greatest, you know? Not realizing that a lot of the propaganda back then was by the state. American exceptionalism, patriotism, America's the greatest country in the world. Glossing over the fact that African Americans were second-class citizens at the time. You know? Doesn't seem so great.
American exceptionalism has become right-wing projection. America is exceptional. I'm an American. Ergo, I'm exceptional. And by exceptional, I mean superior to those from other countries.
Yep.
Notice the turn toward the observer in that string of logic, and how the observer doesn't need to do anything differently to be exceptional. He just has to be born in America.
Be an American.
The observer at first defines America, then connects himself to America, which, by extension, connects him to greatness. That is the definition of narcissism by way of the team pride concept I described in the introduction. That is not a version of American exceptionalism that encourages our country to better itself. That is narcissistic patriotism, the likes of which Oscar Wilde warned us about in the late 1800s.
Yes.
Just because the U.S. helped win World War II, invented rock and roll, followed by another war victory in the Cold War, doesn't mean we're the best thing that's happened on the planet since Jesus conquered death. American exceptionalism leads right-wingers to not only absorb the status quo, but to protect and to promote the status quo. Because American exceptionalism tells rural white Christian Americans that they don't have to change. They're better off if they don't change. They're better off if they don't do anything differently. They can just do what their parents did, thought what their parents thought. Missed out on exploring the world the way their parents missed out on exploring the world. Since it is easier to stay in the same place than it is to explore somewhere new, the past is arguably the best rhetorical tool for right-wing political discourse to capture someone's attention, invoke their point of view, and then convince them that the country is being overrun by anti-American forces.
It's literally just weaponizing nostalgia and the bigotry of their audience, of their base.
The country is actually being overrun by anti-American forces, but not the kinds rustics would have you believe.
Yeah, no, exactly.
The self-anchor of conservative cognition derives from right-wing America's use of identity politics, which, for those of you that don't know, started in the 1980s in the form of Reagan-era dog whistles, dismissive labels such as political correctness, invented by the right, now called wokeness, and other harmful rhetoric that implied immigrants, gays, and all other minorities are lesser citizens than native-born straight white Christian Americans. Put simply, the self-righteous rustic thinks, I am more American than Americans who aren't straight white Christians. This country belongs to me and my people more than it does people who are different from me, because my people founded this country, built this country, and therefore own this country. Since America is ours, we are the reason it is exceptional. I am exceptional because I'm an American, yada, yada, yada. Now that the mediated message has captured the viewer's attention and framed the point from his perspective, the turn toward specific action takes place. The GOP is the party of patriotism. In order to consider myself a patriotic winner, I must vote for the GOP. The third and final anchor of conservative cognition is the fight. It's something I slightly alluded to earlier when I cited America's World War II and Cold War victories. America's superlative exceptionalism derives more from our historical win-loss record in global conflicts, particularly those that took place in the last century. The baby boomer conservative reaction to this is, if I'm going to get in a fight, I want to make sure I'm on the winning side, regardless of the nature of the conflict. Because what do conservative wasps want to be more than anything else, after all? Winners. So now the conservative media message has captured our attention with, once again, narcissistic patriotism, then established the point of view that this is an opportunity for the viewer to feel like a winner, and finally the call to action, vote and give money to the GOP, because we don't have to stand for anything. All we have to do to fulfill our desperate sense of purpose is defend America from the forces of progressive change. Help us feel right by defending what we already have. What do these three anchors of the right-wing anchor and adjustment heuristic tell us about conservative America, especially white rustics? They're losers who want to feel like winners without having to do any of the work. We'll talk more about this when we cover guns, but for now it's important to understand the premise that these socially limited souls are so fearful of, and thus angry toward, the world, because they are not happy with their lives, and they want someone to blame rather than take responsibility themselves, kind of like a child avoids responsibility.
Bingo, that's it.
And embraces blame. To revisit the magic trick metaphor, while the right hand of right-wing America distracts its followers with culture war anecdotes, its left hand, the politicians behind the divisive rhetoric, steals from the poor to give to the rich, spends money the country doesn't have on war.
It's like I mentioned earlier, like towards the beginning of the video. Conservative media, with one hand, distracts you with all sorts of culture war issues, while the people they tell you to vote for are cutting entitlements. They want to do away with your Medicare, your Social Security, give tax cuts to the ultra-wealthy, which do nothing for you, but everything for them. It's amazing how they've made this work for so long.
And attempts to force extreme Christian political views on our society through our courts.
Yep.
The last 42 years have given us the clarity only hindsight can provide with respect to understanding the GOP's true legislative goals.
Yep.
My fifth, Deter 3, explains what that invisible hand of the GOP is up to when the public isn't paying attention. My three primary policy positions of right-wing political leadership are tax cuts,
Yep.
specifically tax cuts for one percenters and corporations, excessive military spending, and politicization of our courts according to right-wing fundamentalist Christian values.
Yes, which it has literally been demonstrated, been proven, been documented. A literal like secret society, an organization of sorts, are one of the main culprits behind getting the three newest, well, excluding Ketanji Brown Jackson, the three newest justices on the Supreme Court before her onto that court. Fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists, extremists. And I say extremists because what they believe does not fall in line with the majority of Americans, according to pretty much every poll.
These three policy goals directly derive from my second Deter 3, the three feathers of right-wing America, which you'll recall are money, military, and religion. So by equating less government with tax cuts, by suggesting safety and security derive from military might, and by arguing America is indeed a white Christian nation, the Republican rhetorical machine plays off of less experienced Americans' ignorance to serve the financial interests of one percenters, corporations, the military-industrial complex, and, let's not forget, satiate rural busybodies with nothing better to do than worry about wokeness. The historical record makes it easy to see what the GOP's true purpose is. More analysis of the GOP base, however, is required to comprehend right-wing America's political success since 1980, and the exacerbating 36-year sequence that led to the devolution of Reaganism into Trumpism. Only by empathizing with Trumplicans can we understand them, and subsequently marginalize them to an even greater extent than they have attempted to marginalize the members of society that don't look, talk, or act like they do.
De-Trumpification.
Thank you for your attention. After watching this, I hope you're less likely to waste your precious attention on conservative media's culture war distraction tactics, because those would have you forget. You don't get change in America by asking nicely.
Yep. Spellbinding. Brilliant. Excellent. Just like the other two videos. Yeah, that was really, really good. This right here, everything that's outlined in this video, as well as the other two videos of his, should have the fullest attention of online leftists, bread tubers, content creators, streamers. Not this woke skull drama. Like, what is a Shark Zero? Someone tell me. I seriously, like, whatever it is, it's not important. This is about the immediate future. This is about actually incorporating real change and stopping the influence of those who manipulate the vulnerable, as outlined in these videos, at the hands of right-wing media, taking advantage of the uneducated, the rural voters, conservatives who have no idea what they're actually fighting for or voting for, the ones being strangled by the invisible hand. Make sure you go subscribe to American Wasp with Deter McBusiness. And if you're new here, thank you for showing up. Make sure you subscribe to me, like the video, comment, share this around. This guy needs more exposure, desperately. I'll see you all very soon.